The eviction notice was stuck to my door with a strip of packing tape that had already started peeling at one corner, curling away from the wood like it wanted nothing to do with what it was announcing. Bright orange. The kind of color you can't pretend not to see. 7 days. That's what it said, in plain block letters, and I stood in the hallway of my building on Augusta Avenue in Kensington Market with my keys still in my hand, reading it 3 times like the words might rearrange themselves into something less final. My name is Spencer Whitlock, and 4 months earlier I'd had a job I actually liked, doing inventory and logistics for a mid-sized furniture importer out in Etobicoke. Decent pay, benefits, a manager who remembered my name. Then the company lost its biggest contract overnight. Some retail chain in the States went under and took half their orders with it, and within 6 weeks they'd laid off almost a third of staff, me included. I'd told myself it was temporary. Everyone tells themselves that. I had savings. Not a lot, but enough to feel like I had room to breathe. Toronto doesn't give you room to breathe for very long, though. Rent on my 1-bedroom was $2,150 a month, and even with EI coming in, I was bleeding money every 30 days. I applied for warehouse jobs, retail jobs, anything with the word associate in the title. A few interviews. Offers. No offers. By the 3rd month, I was behind on rent by enough that the building manager stopped saying hello to me in the lobby and started leaving notices instead. I want to say something here, because I think about it every day now. If you've ever believed that people can surprise you, that someone you barely know can show up at exactly the moment you've stopped expecting anyone to, give this video a like, drop a comment about a time a stranger changed something for you, and subscribe if you want more stories like this one. It costs nothing, and it means more than you'd think. The apartment itself was nothing special. Galley kitchen, water stains on the ceiling above the stove, a radiator that clanked at 2 in the morning like it was trying to communicate something. But it had been mine for the first place I'd ever lived without a roommate, and there's a particular kind of grief in packing up a life that small. I started folding shirts into a duffel bag on day 4, not because I'd given up exactly, but because some part of me had stopped pretending I had a plan. I'd stopped checking my email every 20 minutes. I'd stopped rehearsing the things I'd say in interviews. I was just packing. That's when someone knocked. Soft, almost apologetic, like whoever it was already knew they were interrupting something. I opened the door expecting the super, maybe a neighbor complaining about noise, though God knows I hadn't made any. Instead, there was a woman standing in the hallway I'd only seen twice before, both times from a distance, getting into a gray sedan parked out front. She introduced herself as Eleanor Whitmore. She owned the building, not just my unit, the whole 6-story walk-up, which I hadn't actually known until that moment. I'd always paid rent through a property management company and assumed the owner was some faceless numbered corporation. Eleanor was somewhere in her early 60s, silver hair cut short and practical, wearing a wool coat that looked like it had survived a lot of Toronto winters. She had the kind of face that made you feel like she was already 3 steps ahead of whatever you were about to say. My stomach dropped. I assumed she was there about the notice, maybe to confirm the date, maybe to tell me there was no flexibility left. She glanced past me into the apartment, the half-packed boxes, the bare bookshelf, the duffel bag gaping open on the bed, and something in her expression shifted. Not pity, exactly. More like recognition. "Can I come in for a minute?" she said. Not really a question. I stepped back and let her in, because what else was I going to do? She didn't sit, just stood near the window with her hands folded in front of her, and for a few seconds neither of us said anything. The radiator clanked once, embarrassingly, into the silence. She told me she'd just gotten back from 3 weeks in Halifax visiting her brother, and that morning she'd gone through the building's files for the first time in a while. She'd seen my name on the eviction list. She said it didn't sit right with her, the way the numbers looked on paper. 3 months behind history that had been spotless for 2.5 years before that. She asked me, plainly, what had happened. I almost didn't tell her. There's a stubbornness that kicks in when you've got nothing left to protect except your dignity, and mine was working overtime. But she didn't ask the way people usually ask, like they're gathering evidence for a decision they've already made. She asked like she actually wanted to know, and stood there long enough, quiet enough, that the whole story came out before I'd decided to give it to her. The layoff, the dwindling savings, the interviews that went nowhere, the 3 a.m. spreadsheet math that never came out in my favor. When I finished, she nodded slowly, like she'd been expecting most of it. Then she told me something I hadn't expected at all. Before she bought this building 15 years ago, Eleanor had spent almost 2 decades running a small employment transition program out of a community center in Parkdale, helping people who'd been laid off from manufacturing jobs find their footing again, write resumes, navigate the system. She'd shut it down when funding dried up after the 2008 crash and never quite found the energy to start it back up, though she said she'd thought about it more times than she could count. She'd been turning the idea over again recently, she said, ever since a storefront 2 blocks from here had gone vacant. She owned that building too. She just hadn't had anyone to run it with. Then she made the offer. She said she'd tear up the eviction notice and let me stay rent-free for 3 months. No strings on that part. That was happening regardless. But if I wanted, she also wanted my help getting the center off the ground, cleaning the space, setting up partnerships with local employers, helping design the resume workshops, the persons at the front desk who'd actually lived what the people walking in were living. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the idea was so far outside anything I'd imagined for myself that my brain didn't know what else to do with it. Me? I'd spent 4 months failing to get myself hired anywhere. What exactly did I have to offer people in the same hole I was barely climbing out of? Eleanor just looked at me with this calm, unhurried patience and said something I've turned over in my head more times than I can count since. She said the people who help best are usually the ones who still remember exactly what it felt like to need help. Not the ones who read about it, the ones who lived it. The next few weeks didn't feel like my life anymore, not the one I'd had 4 months of getting smaller and smaller. We took over the storefront on Dundas, used to be a dry cleaner. You could still smell the chemical tang in the walls for the first week, and spent our days scraping old signage off the windows, painting, hauling in second-hand desks from a Facebook marketplace deal. Eleanor negotiated like she'd done it 100 times. She probably had. We called it the Whitmore Resource Center, which felt strange at first, having her name on something I was helping build, but she waved that off like it was the least interesting part of the whole thing. People started showing up faster than either of us expected. A woman named Priya, who'd been a dental hygienist for 11 years before her clinic closed, and needed help figuring out if her credentials would transfer to a new employer. A guy in his 50s, Walter, who'd worked the line at an auto parts plant out in Brampton for 2 decades, and had never once in his life had to write a resume because he'd never needed one before. A 19-year-old kid's high school asking about apprenticeship programs because his dad didn't think university was worth the debt. Every single one of them reminded me of where I'd been sitting 4 weeks earlier, and there was something in watching them walk out the door a little lighter than they'd walked in that started fixing something in me too. Something I hadn't realized was still broken. About 2 months into all this, a man named Desmond Achaby came by to drop off a donation, a stack of office chairs and 2 filing cabinets his company wasn't using anymore. He ran a regional logistics and warehousing firm out near the airport, and while we were hauling the chairs in from his van, he asked what I used to do before the center. I told him about the furniture importer, the inventory work, the systems I'd built for tracking shipments that nobody else on the floor had bothered to learn. His eyebrows went up. He said his company had just landed a contract that was about to triple their warehouse volume, and they were short-staffed on exactly that kind of role. 2 days later, I was sitting across from him in an office that smelled like fresh carpet, and 20 minutes after that, I had an offer in writing. Full-time, benefits, a salary that actually matched what I'd been making before the layoff, maybe a little more. I remember sitting in my car in the parking lot afterward, just holding the printed offer letter, not even reading it again, just holding it, because some part of me still expected it to turn out to be a mistake. I want to ask you something before we get to the end of this. If you've ever had a moment where help came from somewhere you weren't looking, somewhere you'd almost written off, tell me about it in the comments, where you're watching from, and the kindness you remember most. I read every single one. I still volunteer at the center most Saturdays, even almost 3 years later, even with the full-time job and everything else that's filled back in around the edges of my life. Eleanor brought on a small permanent staff a while back, 2 people who do this full-time now, but I haven't been able to let go of my weekend shifts, and I don't think I want to. Last I checked, the center's helped somewhere north of 1,800 people find work, housing referrals, or just somewhere to sit and be taken seriously for an afternoon. The number keeps climbing. What still gets me 3 years on is how the whole thing started, with one woman who looked at a stack of overdue rent in a half-packed apartment and decided, against every reasonable instinct in property management, that the person behind those numbers was worth more than the notice taped to his door. If this one got to you at all, hit like, send it to someone who could use the reminder that things can turn around faster than you'd think, and subscribe for more of these. Because sometimes the week you think is ending everything is actually the week. Something else is just getting started.